I'm a guy that's 24. Each day I build some more. I like episode 7 and episode 8. I'm Rich Boy J. First MOC we're going to take a look at today is titled Anakins Room by Carter Witz, and first and foremost I have to mention that this is just a very unique concept for a build. I don't typically see people attempt Anakin's Room, so I gotta give the builder credit for just doing something that isn't really often attempted. There's so many like MOCs in the LEGO Star Wars community that are people's go-tos and ones that are just done very often. But I like that this is different. This is unique. This isn't something that I don't think I ever would have thought of building in LEGO, but there are a few technical things I like about this build. The first thing I like is how what he's using, I assume to be flex tubing with those Technic pins, the tan ones on the outside of it, to make this arch right around the bed where C-3PO is laying down. I think that's a good technique. If you're building anything with like tan architecture and you need an arch of sorts like this one, that's a pretty cool technique. I like that quite a bit. The other thing I like about this build is how messy it is. I think that if you were really building a droid, like, you would probably have parts and tools literally everywhere, and I think this MOC does a really good job at conveying that. On the left wall you can see there's tools and droid parts on the wall and like a tool rack, and then even under the bed there's stuff just laying around, and there's just random droid parts all over the place in this build, and that's good. That's exactly the type of thing you would want to incorporate into a build like this, to really just help the person looking at this MOC get a good feel for the atmosphere of something like this. I always make it a point to show MOCs of varying sizes in the MOC showcases, and this has to be one of the smallest ones I've ever shown off. If we ignore just the mini MOCs of ships that I've shown off, this is just a 12 by 12 stud MOC, and it'd be even smaller than that if there weren't for the black border. And I think this is very encouraging and inspirational for people who, you know, see some of maybe the large scale MOCs that I do and think like, man, I want to do something cool, but maybe I don't necessarily have the parts or the space to take up an entire room to do a build. And I think MOCs like this really show that you don't need that to do something unique, to do something that is, you know, technically very detailed. So I always like to show off MOCs like this for people who maybe want to get into MOC building but don't necessarily have all the space. I think it's clear from builds like these that that is not necessary. All you need is a little inspiration and at least some parts, and you can do something like this that is pretty unique in my opinion. Before I get into this next build, I do want to say spoiler alert. Is it even still necessary to give spoiler alerts for Jedi Fallen Order? I don't know. If you don't want to know anything about the ending of Jedi Fallen Order, I guess just skip over this build. Although if you're looking at this photo, it's probably too late. It's already spoiled. Well, anyways, this MOC was built by JanT, or I think someone corrected me and said it's actually pronounced YanT. We can get the person who made this MOC to confirm that in the comments. I would actually really appreciate that so I can stop misspelling your name. But I love this MOC. This is a MOC of that final scene in Fallen Order where Seer uses Trilla's Inquisitor lightsaber to fight Vader while Cal is just laying on the floor observing, I guess. And there's a lot of things to like about this build. I like just the architecture of this like Imperial base in the game. I like how it was basically all underwater. Like, that was kind of cool. And I really like how the builder has given that same feel, that same essence to this build by having the actual, you know, like structure of the hallway in the middle of the build, but using that black border and the leaf pieces on the outside of it with the fish to kind of tell you like, yeah, this is actually underwater. I like cool little techniques like that. Like, it's pretty subtle. You know, you didn't need to actually submerge this thing in trans clear studs or something insane like that to give the viewer the understanding that this is underwater. Starting off on the left side of the MOC, I think that's a really good looking Dio build. The dark red visor piece that's usually on the clones is actually a really good idea right there for Dio. That actually looks pretty incredible in my opinion. I like a lot of the techniques he used on the floor, so I'm not sure if this was deliberate or he just didn't press down the pieces all the way, but I think it kind of works for this build that some of the grill tiles aren't like perfectly set in place. It looks like some of them are slightly askew. I don't know, just kind of gives some subtle battle damage to the area. I always like it when people use these door pieces as panels on like the floor of a MOC. It's just a nice, once again, subtle detail you can add to the build. I also appreciate that the edges of the build are kind of lined by these handrails. We don't typically see handrails in Star Wars, so I don't know, it's just a nice cool little detail between the windows and the floor of the build. The action shot with Seer fighting Vader also looks really cool. I can appreciate that he actually edited in real lightsaber effects to this photo. And there's even some subtle greebling on the sides of the build where basically the windows and walls and like the left side of the hallway is cut off, which is always fun. I feel like this is a pretty memorable scene from the game, and anyone who hasn't played the game I think would still just appreciate the building techniques and just how nicely this MOC flows. Before I get into this next build, I guess I should give a spoiler alert for Rebels. There is a spoiler in this MOC from Star Wars Rebels if you don't want to have Rebels spoiled. Actually, you know what? I actually don't even think it's necessary for me to give a spoiler alert for Star Wars Rebels. If Lucasfilm could get away with putting out the soundtrack before Episode 1 back in the day with one of the songs titled Qui-Gon's Noble End, then I should be able to say that this MOC is titled The Death of Caleb Dume. Yes, Caleb Dume dies in Rebels. He dies in this MOC. Sorry you had to hear it this way, but it is what it is. But in terms of the actual build here, there are a few things I really like about this. One, I think the fire technique on the left side is super cool. It's a cool like little explosion build. Explosions are not always the easiest thing to build in Lego, so I like what he did here. He has like the yellow and orange pieces towards the bottom and the red and trans orange pieces towards the top. He also has the fire pieces connected in an interesting way to just give more detail to the explosion, and he's even using some of the newer like superheroes, I don't know, like power energy blast pieces to show where Caleb is basically using the Force to push back the explosion while he protects Hera and puts her on that Imperial gunship. And let's talk about that Imperial gunship, because that thing is pretty freaking cool. We initially saw this vehicle in Star Wars Clone Wars, and they basically had an Imperial version of it in Star Wars Rebels, and I honestly think this would make a really cool Lego set. Like, I like the design of the vehicle, and we see it pretty often in Rebels, so it would have just made sense as a set for them to do. But until then, we have cool people making cool MOCs of them, and I think this build looks really nice. I like this MOC as a whole because it was definitely one of the most, if not the most emotional parts of Star Wars Rebels, seeing Kanan have to die like this, but going out like a boss, saving the love of his life and what we would soon find out, the mother of his child. Like that was pretty incredible, man. Shout out to Caleb Dume. The final MOC we have today is by KW Vauban, and it is a beautiful Naboo Feed Palace hangar, and there's so much to tackle with this build. This is a huge build, and it's still only half of the hangar. Like, I can only imagine what this might look like if someone tried to do a full-sized one. If we look at this pulled back view, we can really just get an appreciation for all of the vehicles in this. The first thing I think anyone would notice in this build is the Starspeeder 3000. Looks like we got a little Star Tours reference in the MOC, which is honestly kind of funny. I think there aren't enough Star Tours references in MOCs. We have a V-Wing flying out of the hangar. We have a bunch of Naboo Starfighters up on the walls back there. This next photo shows an up-close look at the 6 Naboo Starfighters at the top of this build, and I just love this visual so much. Like, when I watch Phantom Menace in that feed hangar, I always think like, man, it would be so cool to see a MOC with that many Naboo Starfighters incorporated into it, and this guy did it. He accomplished it, and that's freaking awesome. I really do like the wall details that he has. There's details all around the back curved walls, and then I also appreciate how the top section curves up with those arch pieces, and he actually did a bit of snot work on the ceiling of the build, right where those Naboo Starfighters are. Towards the bottom of the build, we have some familiar faces, including Anakin, Obi-Wan, Clone Wars Padme, perhaps even Darth Jar Jar. This MOC was made in like 2013, and if I'm not mistaken, that was before the whole Darth Jar Jar craze started, so maybe that's just Jar Jar dressed in black. Then over to the right side, there's our boys C-3PO and R2-D2. The next photo is basically the entrance or exit to the hangar. It was on the left side of the build. If you notice, there was just a big door, and we have what I would assume is Captain Panaka, or another Naboo security officer dressed like Captain Panaka, and this really just gives you a good idea of just the scale of this build. Like, this is a pretty huge doorway. I like the use of those bionicle pieces at the top to represent some wall details. That's actually pretty clever. And I also like the detail he incorporated on the left side of the wall. There's so much detail in this pretty large MOC. Here we have a closer look at the right side of the hangar with once again that V-Wing taking off, and we also just have a bunch of just droids kind of hanging around the hangar, which I appreciate. Like, it's nice to kind of add some liveliness to your build by having a bunch of what I would believe are just, you know, service droids kind of maintaining things things that would be necessary to maintain in the hangar. There's also a ton of just nice wall detail over to the right side in that little small hallway over there, and there's even some like Naboo pilots talking to each other. There's just so much going on in this build. This photo is a closer look at the right side of the build, which I really appreciate because it would have just been so easy for him to just do the inside of the hangar and really not do anything in regards to the outside of it. But the fact that he went and made this pretty intricate design for the outside of the hangar is pretty impressive. Like, I like the statue that he built right here in front of it, and you can even see on the roof of the build there's some decent amount of detail and a statue up top as well. Like, this was clearly very well thought out. I think all the vegetation and grass looks pretty good. I think it's a nice contrast to the tan color of the building, and then of course the grays on the inside of the hangar. And once again, even more droids outside. I wonder if that's supposed to be like some sort of like lawn mower droid that's just maintaining Naboo. You would imagine with a planet like Naboo that they'd want to keep it looking nice and neat, and they'd have tons of just lawn care droids. There's also a couple of Easter eggs on this side of the build. If you look over to the bottom right, it looks like we have a couple of battle droids trying to make their way out of the ground. And then over to the bottom left-hand side, looks like we have a Lord of the Rings reference with Gollum. Now let's take a look at the basement level of the build. You can see he's built a custom flash speeder that looks pretty nice. I like that he went with a custom design because at this point LEGO actually hadn't released the newest flash speeder, and the old one was pretty outdated by this time. Not saying that I don't like that set, I actually do quite like that set, but I appreciated that he actually just went ahead and built his own custom version of it. It looks pretty cool, and there's so much going on down here. First of all, there's lights, and that's awesome. Like, if he did not include lights for this basement level, it would be so much more difficult to see, so I'm actually really glad that he decided to do that. Moving over a little to the right, we have another section of the basement of the hangar with some droids maintaining the floor. We even have like a service cart of some sort, and there's even a pretty detailed room towards the back. As we continue moving to the right side of the basement level of this build, we have another Naboo Starfighter being maintained in this MOC, and there are a lot of Naboo Starfighters in this MOC. Oh my god, I love it. I love the aesthetic of this many Naboo Starfighters being in one build, and you can once more see there are just tons of droids everywhere. There's even a treadwell droid rolling about. There's pilots working on consoles, and even some droids hanging from the ceiling working on this Naboo Starfighter. Behind the Naboo Starfighter, there's even more detail. There's a room back here. I think when I first looked at this, I thought, like, is this some sort of bar? But upon closer inspection, I don't think that's what this is. I think this is just more machinery, just stuff that you might find in the basement of a hangar. And I think that's still pretty cool. Like, it's one thing for, you know, the hangar to be a MOC that you build. It's another thing to actually go about and design an entire basement. And then it's another thing to actually like work so deep into the MOC and have all these details and areas that would be pretty difficult to see if you were just looking at this MOC as an observer. So I find myself really inspired by all the detail and work that the builder put into this. And then over to the right side, we have another one of the Naboo speeders. This is, I guess, one of the combat speeders that they had in episode 1. And there's a droid working on the guns. There's, once again, like, if you look back into the MOC, there's still so much detail back there. I know these aren't the greatest pictures of the build, like, these are just the best pictures I could find, but there's so much to be appreciated in this build. Like, if you look deep into the MOC, you can see he clearly had such a fun time incorporating all these details into this build. And I mean, the Naboo basement is something we have never actually seen in canon, to my knowledge. I don't know, maybe we have in some comic or video game. I want to assume we haven't, and I get the impression that the builder really just took a lot of creative liberties and, you know, was clearly inspired by the hangar and decided, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and take this a step further, and I'm going to build literally every possible thing you could imagine in this Naboo hangar.